If you're taking your MCAT soon, then you might want to know the sine and cosine tricks. Welcome back to day 15 of MCAT 528 and 28. Starting off with the basics of the unit circle, you want to know that the x direction is related to the cosine, whereas the y direction is related to the sine. So at an angle of 0 degrees, the cosine would be 1 and the sine would be 0. However, at an angle of 90, it would be the opposite, where the cosine is 0 and the sine is 1. Now, if you put these numbers in square root form, you know that 1 is also equivalent to square root of 4 over 2. So going down the line, we have square root of 3 over 2, square root of 2 over 2, and square root of 1 over 2, which is just 1/2. Finally, square root of 0 over 2, which is 0. Now this covers the cosine from angle 0 to 90, whereas the sine would be in the opposite direction from 90 to 0. Now that we have that out of the way, let's go over inclined planes. The first major thing that you want to understand is that the x direction, instead of being horizontal, is actually parallel to the plane, whereas the y direction is perpendicular. Now you should note that there is no motion in the y direction because the mass is not going into the inclined plane or above it. However, there is acceleration in the x direction, which is why this is the one that we want to focus on. Therefore, in order to find the x component of the acceleration, which would be the force of gravity parallel, you would have to multiply the weight by the sine of theta. So in order to find the acceleration of a mass on a frictionless ramp, you can just multiply gravity by the sine of theta. Now do the math on your own if you don't believe me, but what's important to note is that the mass does not actually matter in the case of a frictionless ramp. When there is friction, however, the formula for this, being the force of friction is equal to the coefficient of friction times the normal force, you want to calculate the y direction. The y component in this case being the normal force, which is equal to the weight times the cosine of theta. Now, while on the topic of inclined planes, just know that the mechanical advantage is equal to the force output over the force input, and the efficiency is equal to the work output over the work input. However, a trick to calculate the mechanical advantage would be to simply multiply the distance traveled along the plane divided by the height of the plane. Next up is projectile motion. So assuming that you were given the initial velocity of the projectile as well as the angle at which it was launched, you can find the x component of this initial velocity by multiplying the initial velocity times the cosine of the angle. The y direction of this initial velocity would be the opposite, which is the initial velocity multiplied by the sine of the angle.